Chapter 12. The old weathered skull had the chill of the grave about it, even in the firelit warmth of the artillery tent. The delicate silver wire felt like a thread of pure ice beneath Malus's slender finger as he traced its convoluted path. During his first tortured glimpse of the relic, he'd believed that the wire was meant to hold the skull and the lower jaw together. But now he could see that this wasn't so. It was one continuous loop that turned and twisted upon itself again and again, enclosing the bone within a weave that had a pattern and a purpose to it that was maddening in its complexity. The skull itself felt like cold, unyielding stone. It leached the heat from his hand, leaving it numb and aching, even as the rest of him sweltered in the tense, hot, smoky air. Worst of all were the skull's empty eye sockets. The black pits swallowed up the firelight and revealed nothing of their depths. Yet for all that Malus could feel the cold weight of the skull's penetrating stare. It was as if some remnant of the owner's malignant intelligence still haunted the empty brain case and studied him with cold, reptilian interest.
Damn sorceress thing, Malus thought. I'd just as soon take a mallet to it.
He knew next to nothing about sorcery, and what Malus didn't know, he didn't trust. Not for the first time, he wished he'd forced Nagaira to come along and take charge of the relic. She would have had its riddles unravelled in a moment, leaving him to focus on getting to the temple and reaping its hidden treasures. Malus sat propped against a pile of floor pillows near the tent's fire pit, with a weight of furs and wool blankets lying over his lower body. The cuts to his hand, forearm and scalp had been neatly stitched, and the healing skin itched fiercely despite its soothing ointment covering the wounds. A wooden tray dusted with crumbs and an empty water flagon lay on its side close by, next to the highborn swords and his saddlebags. The journal of Uriel the Forsaken lay in Malus's lap, the parchment pages opened to the book's final entry. There was a sound of rustling leather, and Malus glanced over to see Lenara stooping through the entryway of the tent. She let out a grunt of surprise at the sight of him.
"Awake at last," she said, clearly relieved. "We were starting to fear you'd sleep through the winter, my lord."
Malus frowned. He knew from the aches in his muscles and joints that he'd been lying asleep for some time.
"How long?" "Nearly 4 days, my lord."
She shuffled across the tent and began adding fresh sticks to the fire.
"The first day was the worst. You were like ice, and nothing we did would warm you up. The artillery who were guarding the camp said you looked like a vengeful spirit when you came staggering down out of the hills. Even the shades in the longhouse thought you were a ghost come back to haunt them. That's what they're calling you now. Anuraksha."
The highborn chuckled. The white, eh? If only they knew. Unconsciously, his free hand went to his throat, where he could still feel the long bruises left by the willow hag's implacable grip.
Is it morning or night?
"Night, and late at that. I've just got back from checking the men, keeping watch on the Noglir. Dalvar and Van here are drinking with Urhan Beg in the longhouse."
Nothing good can come of that,
Malus thought.
Whose tent is this?
Lenara shrugged.
"Yours now, my lord. It was Nual's, but Beg ordered his things moved into Rahir's old tent, since he's now the eldest living son. Not that anyone has seen Nual in the last 4 days or so."
The retainer gave Malus a pointed look.
"The Urhan wants to talk to you as soon as you've awakened."
Yes, I imagine he does,
Malus said, ignoring the implication in Lenara's tone.
I expect he wants to fulfill his part of the bargain and be rid of us just as quickly as he can.
Lenara poked at the embers with a short length of kindling, then indicated the skull with the stick's smoking end. Has it given up any secrets yet?
No,
the Highborn said reluctantly, reaching for his saddlebags.
And there's very little that makes sense in Uriel's journal.
Malus pulled a thick scarf from the saddlebag, wound it tightly around the relic, and carefully placed it back in the bag.
Unless I'm much mistaken, I don't think Uriel knew much more about the skull than we did.
Why do you say that, my lord? Malus leaned back against the pillows, concealing a sigh of relief. He was startled at how weak he felt after the ordeal in the hills. A small part of his mind reeled at the thought of how close he'd come to dying.
No,
he thought fiercely.
It proves that if my will is strong, nothing can stop me.
He picked up the journal, flipping back through the delicate sheets of human parchment.
Uriel's notes make reference to a number of sources. The Saga of Crimson, the 10 Tomes of Kresh, and others. But very few direct observations about the skull itself. No insight about the runes or the silver wire. Either he was already familiar with the runes and what they said, and knew what the wire did, or they weren't relevant to the mystery of the temple and its contents, which leaves us with nothing to go on. Malus suppressed a smile. You're almost too clever sometimes, Lenara, he thought. Good thing for me, you have nowhere else to go. That's true, but, he said, raising a long finger, the journal does mention a few possible clues.
The Highborn searched the entries carefully.
Here we are. There's a note here that reads, Kal Hadar in the north, and describes a wooden valley haunted by beasts in the shadow of a mountain cleft by the axe of a god. Then, he flipped through a few more pages, there's a reference here to the key to the gate of infinity and the temple beyond.
Lenara frowned. And this Kal Hadar is the name of the valley?
Or the temple, perhaps, Malus said. I'm not sure.
The retainer poked at the fire some more, considering her next words carefully. I thought Nagaira said the skull would lead us to the temple.
She did.
And yet
it's doing nothing of the sort,
Malus replied.
It's possible that Nagaira didn't know as much about the skull as she let on.
Lenara nodded slowly, her face carefully neutral. Perhaps so, my lord. That being the case, is it wise to continue at this point, as weak as you are?
Weak? Weak?
Malus flung the furs and blankets aside. Anger burned along muscle and sinew in his chilled limbs, propelling him to his feet. He leapt at Lenara, one hand snatching a half-burned stick from the fire, while the other closed about his retainer's throat.
I should put a red coal under your tongue for such insolence! Do not presume to judge my strength, Lenara. I will find this temple and reap whatever treasures it holds, and nothing will stand in my way. Least of all you!
Lenara had gone rigid at Malus's touch. She met her lord's eyes with a cold black stare of her own. No one questions your terrible will, my lord, she said with preternatural calm. She eyed the red-hot ember hanging scant inches from her face. Shall I quench the hot coal with my tongue? With an effort, Malus reined in his temper. He dropped the stick back in the fire.
And how would you give orders to the men afterwards?
The Highborn gave her a rude shove that sent her sprawling.
Go to the Urhan and tell him I am coming,
he said.
And don't question my strength ever again.
Yes, my lord, Lenara replied, her face carefully neutral. She rose smoothly to her feet and slipped gracefully from the tent.
Malus waited for the space of 2 more deep breaths, and then collapsed onto the blankets. His arms and legs quivered in the wake of the sudden burst of energy. His mind roiled with a tumult of thoughts. It was bad enough that he'd taken such a gamble with Lenara. She could have handled him like a kitten if her anger had gotten the better of her, as his had. Worse, it was foolish to make an enemy of one's own lieutenant on an expedition as risky as this one. But worst of all was the suspicion that now festered like poison in the back of his mind. If Nagaira knew less about the skull than she'd let on, perhaps she had other reasons for remaining back at the Hag. Had she made a cat's paw out of him? The notion did little to improve his humour, but the anger soon quelled his rebelling muscles and returned a little fire to his veins. Slowly and deliberately the Highborn rose to his feet and started to dress. As drained as he was, Malus still felt more at ease with his armour on and his swords belted in place. It was indeed well past midnight, and one moon shone full and bright in a sky crowded with tatters of high-flying cloud. The pale light glimmered on a carpet of freshly fallen snow. He drank in the cold air gratefully, a little surprised at how pleasant it felt.
Not so cold as the Willow Hag's embrace,
Malus thought ruefully, as he made his way to the longhouse. The great hall was practically empty. A light dusting of ash from the fireplaces lay on the tumbled floor, pillows and rugs. Dalvar, Vanheir, and a half-dozen older shades sat near the Urhan's dais, passing a wineskin between one another and smoking from pale clay pipes. Neither of Malus's men appeared drunk, though it was clear that several of the shades were deep in their cups. Urhan Beg had evidently declined the wine, and instead reclined in his great carved chair, brooding over a pipe of his own. Lenara was nowhere to be seen. Vanheir rose silently to his feet as the Highborn approached the dais, his expression calculating. Dalvar finished off a long swig from the skin and raised it in salute.
"My lord Anaraksha walks the world of the living once more,"
he said with a roguish grin. The other Arturi chuckled respectfully. The Urhan made no reply.
"My thanks, great Urhan, for your hospitality,"
Malus said,
"and your generosity to my men. I trust they haven't been seduced from their duties by your fine wine and warm hearth."
The Urhan shrugged.
"It's no affair of mine if they have."
"As it happens, my turn at watching the Noglir is almost at hand,"
Vanheir said smoothly, then offered Malus a short bow.
"With your leave, my lord, I will depart."
Malus nodded severely, but the knight made no reaction, instead bowing to the Urhan and striding quietly from the hall.
"And you, Dalvar?"
the Highborn inquired. Nagaira's man shrugged expansively.
"The morning watch is mine, dread lord, but there's plenty more night left for sleeping. In the meantime, I'm learning what I can at the feet of these old ghosts." "And what are they learning from you, I wonder?"
Malus thought. Since his realization about Nagaira, his mind had started to boil with suspicions. The sooner they were in the wastes, the better. Fighting for one's life left little time for treachery.
"What brings you walking in the snow so late at night, city dweller?"
Beg asked, his gaze hard and appraising. The Highborn bowed to Urhan Beg.
"My lieutenant informed me that you wished to speak with me as soon as I awoke, great Urhan. I did not wish to keep you waiting." Your lieutenant, Beg sneered. A woman bearing sword and armour in peacetime. It's unseemly.
Malus shrugged.
The brides of Cain bear arms all year long, and no one faults them. Lunara Ithil went to war and found she liked the taste of it. What's more, she is very, very good at it. I would be a fool to overlook such skills simply because Nagaroth is not at war now. Regardless, as you so clearly pointed out, my retainers are no affair of yours. Now, what did you wish to speak to me about?
Beg leaned forward in his chair, his hand going to the medallion at his neck.
The Ankri Dam is a powerful relic,
the chieftain said, rubbing the polished Ithelmar thoughtfully.
With it, I know when a man lies to me. I haven't seen my son Newall for almost 4 days. Not since you left to visit the Willow Hag. Did you see him that night?
Malus considered Beg carefully.
He could be bluffing, Malus thought. Do I take that risk? Yes, I saw him, the Highborn said after a moment's thought. He waited until I left the tree and tried to steal the medallion from me.
Several of the archery shook their heads at the news. They didn't seem that much surprised. The Urhan eyed Malus balefully.
Did you kill him? No, I didn't. Did you hurt him?
Malus smiled, holding up his stitched arm.
I gave as good as I got, Great Urhan, but there were 7 of them. Then what happened to Newall and his men? I can't say for certain, Malus replied. I had the medallion, they tried to take it from me, and I escaped. Beyond that, I don't know.
For a long time the Urhan said not a word, staring into the Highborn's dark eyes, as though he could pour through them like a book. Eventually, he gave a snort of disgust and leaned back in his chair.
Stupid boy,
he muttered, half to himself.
What's the point of having a medallion if there's no one to pass it on to? You should have thought of that before you set him against me,
Malus thought, suppressing a smile. One of the shades spoke up as he reached for the wineskin.
What about the story Jang here told? About those dark horsemen near Seventree Hill? Horsemen, Beg spat. Who brings horses into these hills?
Malus saw Dalvar stiffen. He shot a surreptitious glance at Malus, who kept his face impassive. Dark riders, Beg, filled with Cain's wrath, the Highborn thought. Horses and men who do not suffer from wounds, fatigue, or fear. Deathless, patient, and relentless.
I can appreciate your concern for your son, Great Urhan, Malus said, and I do not wish to distract you from the search for Newell and his men. So let us be on our way and create no further distraction for you or your clan.
The Highborn drew himself to his full height and folded his arm imperiously.
I require a guide to the frontier, one who can lead me past the Druki watchtowers and to the edge of the Chaos Wastes. Why not take the Spear Road? I don't recall personal questions being included as part of our bargain, Hanbeg. It's enough for you to know that I need to get to the frontier quickly and quietly. What part of the wastes are you trying to reach?
Malus squared his jaw.
There is a mountain in the wastes that looks as though it were split by the axe of a god. Somewhere near the foot of that mountain is Kol Hadar.
The assembled shades stirred uneasily, throwing dire looks at one another. Beg gave Malus a bemused look, his eyebrows furrowing in concern.
You're looking for Kol Hadar? Why? Questions, Hanbeg. Can you get me to that part of the frontier or not? The Urhan thought it over for some time, while the Arturi passed the wineskin between them and muttered under their breath. "Yes, this can be done," he said carefully. "In fact, it can be done very quickly, if your heart is up to the task. Now I ask you to speak plainly, Urhan Beg. What do you mean?" Beg tapped the stem of his pipe against his stained lower teeth. "There is a path through the hills," he said. A path that's not entirely of this world. At certain times, it is possible to walk through that path from one end to another, and cover 100 leagues in a single night. I did it myself once, many years ago. But it is not for the faint of spirit." Malus smiled. "Believe me, we have no small experience with such places. I'm certain we are up to the journey." The Urhan looked Malus in the eye, and for the first time he smiled. "On your head it be, then. As it happens, the moons and the seasons are in a very favourable alignment, so the road should be easy to follow. Gather your men, Darkblade. We will leave an hour before sundown. And in the meantime?" Beg leaned back in his chair, his eyes glittering in the firelight. "In the meantime, take what joy of the sunlit world you can."
By late afternoon, Malus had roused his warband and set them to making preparations for travel. Despite Urhan Beg's ominous warnings, he was eager to be moving once more. Malus uncorked the glazed earthenware jug and poured another dollop of viscous fluid onto the silken cloth in his hand. For an instant, the poisonous slime was shockingly cold against his bare skin, but within moments the affected area had gone numb with the effects of the toxin. Over time, most Cold One Nights lost all feeling in their skin. In some cases, even the ability to smell and taste, after years of exposure to the Noglir's slime. But those were concerns for the future. Today, Malus needed the use of his Noglir, spite, and so he paid the necessary price. Lunara waited patiently in the dark confines of the tent, holding the backplate of the Highborn's armor as Malus shrugged into his robes in chitin. "Any sign of Beg?" he asked.
"None, my lord. The crone in his tent says she has not seen him since last night. I don't think he's anywhere in the camp."
Malus pulled the laces on the chitin tight, then picked up his breastplate and fitted it into place. With the ease of long practice, Lunara fitted the snug backplate around the Highborn's shoulders and waist, and then began to buckle the two halves together. Malus grunted thoughtfully as Lunara drew the straps tight.
"Possibly looking for his son, or planning some other sort of mischief. Inform the men to keep their crossbows ready once we set out."
"Yes, my lord."
The Highborn paused.
"How long until Van Heer's oath runs its course?"
3 more weeks,
the retainer answered.
"Do you suspect something?"
"I always suspect something, Lunara. He's been talking a lot to Dalvar, and Dalvar has been talking to the Urhan. His oath doesn't allow him to act directly against me, but that wouldn't stop him from sharing what he knows about me with anyone who will listen."
Lunara picked up the Highborn's left vambrace and slipped it over his arm, sliding it up to Malus's shoulder like a jointed steel sleeve.
"You never should have accepted his oath," she said darkly. "Far better to have taken his life and have been done with it."
Malus shrugged, a gesture mostly lost beneath the weight of his armor.
"He comes from a powerful household. I thought it would be useful to have something to hold over them. And at the time, Binding him to me seemed like the most humiliating punishment I could imagine. It was a fair wager, and his pit fighter lost.
His Noglier lost, Lenara corrected. You were wagering on the Cold One fight after the gladiatorial games.
Malus frowned. Were we? No matter. He bet against me and lost. And since then he's observed the particulars of his oath, with ruthless, hateful punctiliousness. I admire him for that, truth be told.
Do you still intend to kill him?
Oh yes, possibly even today. Keep a close eye on him and Elvar. If Beg tries any treachery, and either of them tries to help the Urhan, make certain you kill them both.
The afternoon sky had turned leaden, and drifts of snow whirled about in the cold air. The Cold Ones were saddled and drawn up in line, under the wary eyes of their riders. 5 days in the corral had left them snappish and sullen, despite regular meals of venison and boar. It was already getting dark beneath the snow-covered limbs of the forest, and Malus was growing increasingly impatient. Sensing his master's mood, Spite clawed restlessly at the frozen earth and rumbled deep in his throat. Malus paced down the length of the column, making a show of inspecting the warband as a way of concealing his unease. Lunara sat in her saddle at the end of the line, her crossbow in her lap, her eyes searching the shadows to either side of the column. Delvar and his mount were in the centre of the column. Malus came upon Nagaira's man as he was checking the girth straps on the saddle.
I believe you still have something of mine,
the highborn asked, holding out his hands. The rogue grinned up at Malus, and the small iron knife seemed to magically appear in his palm. Are you certain you don't want me to hold on to it? Dalvar asked. We still have Urhan Beg to deal with.
Do you think he'll try to turn on us?
Dalvar shrugged. Of course, don't you? Malus picked the blade from Dalvar's hand.
You've been spending time in his hall. What do you think?
I think he believes you've killed his son. Even if you didn't, you embarrassed him by recovering that medallion of his when Nual couldn't. The Druki pulled the last strap tight and turned to face Malus. Frankly, he's obligated to betray you. They're rustics, but they aren't that much different from us. If he doesn't get the better of you at this point, his clan will think him weak. That wouldn't bode well for his future. Malus studied the retainer carefully.
And how do you suppose he's going to do this?
Dalvar shook his head. I don't know. I've tried to get a sense of the man in the last few days, but he's a canny one. If you want my advice, my lord, we'll keep him close at hand. Once we've started on this path he's been so ominous about. The Druki straightened and glanced past Malus' shoulders. There's the old wolf now. Malus turned to see Beg and 2 of his men standing in the shadow of a snow-covered cedar, speaking quietly among themselves. The highborn looked back at his men.
Sahanisha!
Malus called.
Mount up!
As the Druki swung into their saddles, the highborn approached Urhan Beg. The Arturi chieftain eyed him with undisguised malice.
My men are ready, great Urhan,
Malus said. On closer inspection, the highborn saw that the old shade's boots and breeches were damp.
You've been searching by the river,
Malus thought.
Ready? That remains to be seen,
sneered Beg.
But we'll find out soon enough. Stay close. We've much ground to cover before nightfall.
With that, the 3 Arturi set off at a silent, ground-eating pace, slipping through the camp and heading north.
Malus was forced to jog back to Spite and mount quickly before the scouts were lost to sight.
"Forward!"
Malus ordered, grabbing up the reins. He caught sight of the scouts' retreating backs and put the spurs to his Noglir's flanks.
"Let the game begin,"
Malus thought. It was not long at all before Malus and his warband were forced to dismount, prodding their recalcitrant mounts up steep and overgrown slopes, as they had in days past. After the first hour, however, Malus began to note that the wildlife in the area was much more subdued, if not entirely non-existent. With each mile northwards, the sound of the woods grew quieter, and fewer birds darted between the black-boled trees. The growing stillness conveyed a sense of menace that set the highborn's nerves on edge. He could tell the rest of his warband felt it too, from the way they eyed every deep shadow they passed. Some of the men had taken to carrying their crossbows at the ready, as if expecting an ambush at any moment. After less than 2 hours, the light started to fade in the western sky. Strangely, the going became somewhat easier. The trees and undergrowth had grown sparse and taken on a grey, sickly cast. Malus began to notice a chill in the air. Not the dry cold of the winter wind, but a kind of clammy stillness that ran along the ground beneath the trees and sank deep into one's bones. Soon the landscape was painted with hues of inconstant, otherworldly light, as the auroras of the Chaos Wastes lit in the northern horizon. Against this unsettling display, Malus could see that the hills ahead were earth, stripped bare by millennia of wind and snow. The highborn focused his eyes on the dark-robed figures several yards ahead, and drove Spite onwards, wondering how much further they had yet to go. As it happened, when Malus led Spite over the next hilltop, he found the artillery waiting for him halfway down a long, fairly gentle slope leading to a broad valley. The slope was dotted with dozens of moss-covered boulders and tussocks of low grass. Everything was silhouetted in shifting, pale green light, making the wisps of fog in the valley below seem to glow with a life of their own. Beg and his men waited near one of the boulders. Malus hoisted himself into the saddle and urged Spite in their direction. He relaxed minutely, more comfortable in the open terrain than he had been in the overgrown hills behind him. The Urhan's eyes were hidden in shadow as Malus approached, but the highborn could feel the weight of his stare all the same.
"We've come to the beginning of the path," the chieftain said. "We will walk along with you for a way, but the rest of the journey is for you alone."
"What is this place?"
Malus asked, shifting in the saddle.
"It is called the Wighthallows,"
Beg answered.
"It is a place where the dead do not rest easy."
"Does this frighten you, city dweller?"
Malus glared at the man.
"I've faced one wight already, Urhan. I can face another."
Beg chuckled.
"We shall see."
The shades turned and made their way downslope. Malus paused to make certain the rest of the column had crested the hill and had closed the distance behind him, then sent Spite padding along after the artillery. As the column proceeded, Malus noticed that the boulders and the scattered tussocks grew more numerous closer to the bottom of the slope. The boulders themselves were oddly shaped, with a mix of rounded and sharp edges that seemed maddeningly familiar. Suddenly there was a strange metallic crunch, and Spite's gait stumbled a bit. Malus glanced down and saw that the Cold One had stepped on one of the tussocks. The gleam of bare metal winked in the ghostly light.
Malus realized with a start that he was looking at a crumpled steel breastplate, covered in a thin layer of dirt and grass. They had come upon the edge of a great battlefield. Ahead, the artillery had all but disappeared into the lambent mist. Malus fought down a rising sense of unease and pressed on. A fog hungrily swallowed rider and beast, restricting vision and muffling all sound. Spite balked at the change in atmosphere, but Malus nudged him on. Shapes came and went in the mist. 2 great obelisks appeared to either side of Malus, covered in the looping sigils of old Ulthuan. Faintly, Malus could hear Spite's talons clicking along bare stone. Were they on a roadway? More shapes appeared, clustered on either side of the path. Malus took them for more boulders at first, but upon second glance, he realized they were elven chariots. Their wheels rotted away and their armored flanks dented and rent. He caught sight of helmets, rusted swords and spearheads, their hafts long gone to dust. The highborn looked about for any sign of the artillery. He felt a vague sense of dislocation. "It's the fog," he thought. Or was it? He could just see the shapes of the scouts ahead. Malus kicked Spite into a trot, expecting to catch up with them in moments. But the fog had apparently distorted his sense of distance. It felt like long minutes before he caught up with Beg and his men. "What happened here?" Malus asked. His voice sounded strange and indistinct, even to his own ears. "One of old Anarian's generals built a road here during the First War," Beg replied, his voice sounding as though it were coming from a long way off. "It winds through these valleys for many, many leagues. In the daylight, you can just see the black stones of the roadway poking up from the earth. Legend says it was built for a siege against a city of demons far to the north. But no one knows for certain if such a place ever existed. It's long gone now. The general took his mighty army north and met with tragedy. Some stories say he was betrayed. A rare few even go so far as to accuse your great witch king of the deed, while others claim the general was simply a fool. Regardless, the great march turned into a bloody, bitter retreat, fraught with sorcery and slaughter. Every mile of this road is soaked in blood, the stories go. The stones of the road are mortared with bone. Malus felt a chill sweep across his skin. The wind moaned faintly in the darkness. Or was that the sound of a distant horn? It is said that such was the power of the demon host that they fixed the moons in their courses and fought beneath a mantle of perpetual night. The echoes of that power and the restless spirit of the dead linger here even now. When the proper season comes around and the moons are in the right phase, that long night resumes once more. The fog appeared to be thinning now. It lingered like a pall at the edges of his vision, but at the same time, Malus could see more of his surroundings. Piles of armor, splintered shields and notched swords. Ruined chariots with the barding of their horses resting in their rotted traces. A banner pole leaned at a drunken angle amid a tangle of breastplates, helmet and mail. The standard was heavy with dried gore, hanging listlessly in the mist. Malus could taste the dread in the air. It had a coppery tang, like spilled blood. They travelled on. Malus began to notice more details as they went. The elaborate carvings of chariot and armour stood out in sharp relief. Polished Ithelmar glowed with a pale bluish light.
He began to see the bones of skeletons amid the piles of armour. Once he passed an upturned helm still holding the skull of the man who wore it. The jaws gaped wide in a silent scream of anguish or rage. There was a light up ahead. A bluish radiance suffused the mist, growing in intensity as they drew nearer. The sides of the road were crowded with chariots and wagons, the detritus of an army on the retreat. Their sides were raked and torn, hewn and hacked by tooth, claw, and blade. The bodies of the dead were everywhere, still clutching their weapons in skeletal hands. The air trembled. Malus felt the vibration against his skin. It shook with the din of battle, but no sound reached his ears. The Highborn reached for his sword, taking some comfort in the familiar solidity of its hilt. He could feel the presence of others around him, horses and men moving past him, away from the nightmare they'd found in the far north. The air quivered with silent screams. Suddenly there were robed figures on either side of him. The shades had stopped, and he hadn't realized it. Their gaze was focused on the road ahead. As Malus reined in his mount, he saw the horror they beheld. An army of the dead stood astride the road, gleaming with the unearthly glow of the grave. Enamelled armour shone in the pale blue light, hanging on the skeletal frames of soldiers and horsemen. Some held spears and swords, while others held up grasping, claw-like hands. Points of cold blue light gleamed from the pits of their eyes, and their jaws gaped in silent cries of despair. At their head stood a great prince, his armour enamelled in silver and gold. In his right hand he held a fearsome-looking sword, its length etched with runes of power. His left hand held a torn standard, its ragged helm dripped with fresh blood.
"Who disturbs our rest?"
the undead prince cried. His voice was a thin, keening whisper, like the sound of wind whistling over stone.